provincial, across, horizontally and vertically, everyone has to work, and the landing place is the district. All of us should land in the district. And I also want to just say what local government is supposed to do according to the Constitution. Local government is supposed to structure, manage their administration, their budget, and planning processes to give priority to the basic needs of the community and to promote the social and economic development of the communities. So that is the mandate of local government, which is connected to the rest of government. And I just want to take us back to 94 when we first came to this democratic government. And there was a guiding document that was called the Reconstruction and Development Program, right, which was supposed to be the program that guided us as we went into government. And this program, I quote, said, growth, development, reconstruction, redistribution, and reconciliation into a unified program. That's what we had to do. But the key to this link is an infrastructure program that will provide access to modern and effective services such as electricity, water, telecommunication, transport, health, education, and training for all our people, amongst others. The program will both meet basic needs and open up previously suppressed economic and human potential in urban and rural areas. In turn, this will lead to an increased output in all sectors of the economy. And by upgrading our infrastructure and human resource development, we will also enhance export capacity. Mm-hmm. Now, this is what we said in 94, and this is what we said we would do, and I think that's where we are. Having COVID, and COVID has exposed the weaknesses and the deep fault lines, both in terms of basic services, in terms of infrastructure, but also poverty, hunger, and lack of economic activities in rural areas, in townships, in peri-urban areas. And we have seen even the weak link in terms of transport, people having to queue and travel long distances just to get basic groceries and basic needs. So obviously, the district development model will seek to bring these services nearer to the people, but to also ensure that the infrastructure of the country links not only the district itself, but links between districts, between our commercial centers, and also with our neighbors as well, because the South African economy cannot be an island divorced of the economy of the continent. We must always remember that we're part of the ecosystem of the continent, and its future is intrinsically linked with the aspirations of South Africa and of all its members. And therefore, it would be good to have set out priorities and projects. However, we can better integrate with the continent if we cluster our projects and priorities in line both with Agenda 2063 and with the African Development Bank, which funds some of these projects. And they have what is called high five priorities. And these high five priorities, I want to just mention them. They say light up and power Africa. Obviously, it speaks to our energy needs.
Oh, yeah.
Both renewable and otherwise. It also says feed Africa. Now, when you say feed Africa, it means you look at the entire value chain of agriculture and its infrastructure. Also, you look at the linkages, not only within your country, but within your neighboring SADC and the continent. And of course, feeding Africa also means that you have to look at the ocean's economy, because it's a big economic frontier, but it has also a lot that can feed Africa. So you can't leave it out. And it means that you have to innovate, have logistics, marketing, and exporting. And it says industrialize Africa, which obviously implies that we have to have infrastructure that will assist us in industrialization. For instance, the ICT infrastructure. We can't have successful development, district development model, or even a development in South Africa if we don't have wall-to-wall ICT infrastructure. We can't even begin to look at the inequalities if we don't have wall-to-wall ICT infrastructure. We've seen it during COVID, how those who have ICT infrastructure were able to continue with their lives. They could order things they want and delivered, and kids could go to school online and others couldn't. So this is a very important aspect. And of course, it also says you must integrate Africa, which means that we just, last year, there was a launch of the Continental Free Trade, which means as we industrialize, as we grow food, we must be looking at how do we integrate with the continental markets, because that should be our biggest trading partner, the continent, not EU as it is at the moment. And therefore, if we are to integrate Africa, it means we must also have infrastructure that integrates Africa, whether it's road, rail, sea, ports, whether it's ICT, and so on. And then the last 5 is improve the quality of life of the people of Africa through health, education, safe drinking water, sanitation, jobs, amongst others. And all this has to be driven by the citizens, the majority of whom are women and youth. So we cannot talk about all these projects, infrastructure, and so on without locating where women and youth are going to be and what role they are going to be playing and what part of this infrastructure they will be developing. And of course, linked to that is the capacity, not only the capacity of the state and skills, but also the capacity and skills of our communities, the women I'm talking about, the youth I'm talking about. And so it means as part of this whole infrastructure, we have to have a skills revolution, skills that will be tailor-made towards what the economy needs, to the demands of the economy, not just random skills. So it's very important, especially during COVID and post-COVID, because a lot of people will be unemployed. And therefore, when we kickstart the economy, the skills must match the demands of the economy. And therefore, this implies that our districts and cities must position themselves to support and meet our regional and national priorities. This requires better coordination and the capacitization of the district level so that also local municipalities can be more effective. Now, one of the things that we have experienced in this district development model and in local government generally is the lack of critical skills. And therefore, the district model seeks to provide those critical skills, at least at a district model, and they can be shared by the local municipalities until such time that every municipality can have those skills. Skills like planning, engineers, accountants, and so ICT specialists, and so on. So we think the district model will also help. But also, one of the things we must not look at as a social issue is housing.
All right.
Housing cannot only be seen as a social issue. Yes, it addresses a social issue, but it creates jobs, but also it has a multiplier effect, because if you build 1 million houses, it means those 1 million houses will need linen, they will need furniture, they will need cookers, they need fridges. So it has a multiplier effect in the economy. And so we mustn't dismiss it just as a social issue. I think it does have a big part in the economy. And therefore, when we do all this, we must also look at creating sustainable, vibrant, resilient, smart, climate smart communities, which means we must bring in also the climate issues and resiliency into our communities. So I conclude, before you stop me, that the RDP had envisaged that when it sought the localized development, because the RDP also said we must decentralize the economic activities. So the district development model is a good way of decentralizing the economic activities. And it says, to conclude, we must seek to help people generate economic wealth in their chosen communities. People must not only be able to generate wealth if they leave their areas and go to Johannesburg or Durban or Cape Town. They must be able to do that within their chosen communities. And when they migrate to the cities, it must be out of choice, not out of desperation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. The latter of what you speak to is exactly what many have been aspiring for so many years, in that you do not leave out of the comforts of not having a choice, but literally going out into the big metros to sustain yourself, and also a push for you to generate some sort of generational wealth. But in current day South Africa, we are seeing that that picture is not necessarily taking place. And this is where I would like to bring a group executive of the Infrastructure Delivery Division at the Development Bank of South Africa, Re Chwene Rampele, where we ask about the role of the Development Bank of South Africa. We speak about infrastructure development, but at the same time, we hardly ever get to a conversation about the mandate of DBSA in filtering into the objectives that government is seeking.
Thank you so much, Timisang, and thank you, Honorable Minister, and my fellow panelists and the viewers. So let me start by saying the DBSA has been quite a long-standing partner for local government. But let me also then contextualize this in relation to our mandate, to say, obviously, the mandate of the DBSA is aimed at deepening economic growth, again, beginning to look at institutional development and strengthening the institutions that we really work with. But again, that we do through infrastructure financing, as well as we're doing that through infrastructure implementation. Hence, if you look at the way the DBSA is pushing its value chain, is making sure that projects are well prepared, projects are well planned, and projects are given the funding opportunity or funding for that is necessary to advance the development. And also we think what is critical is also the implementation of such projects. It's one thing else to have the funding and one thing to get the infrastructure on the ground. And I think our position as the DBSA was also to then begin to want to look at deepening that approach of strengthening the capacity of the state to deliver on infrastructure. And again, also looking at the maintenance. If you look to many of the infrastructure we built happen to really be so neglected. And many of these protests that you see, erupting everywhere is because of ailing infrastructure that has not really been maintained for quite a long time. And like, as I said, our infrastructure development mission extends also to the region and the continent. And we believe local government is critical to our mission. And now, based on that context, let me also then say that the district development model, for us as the DBSA, we looked at it as the right instrument to deepen local government and developmental local government. And we're just not say local government, but developmental local government. And for that matter, we are very clear to say, the principles are very clear also to say, developmental local government can only be realized when government do the following. When government or local government provide household infrastructure and services, I'm sure then you will see the happy communities. And we're also looking at the creation of livable, integrated cities, towns, and the rural areas, as the minister has alluded. But also critical is the local economic development component of it. And those are the three critical things that we believe as the DBSA, we need to support government in ensuring that our local government is poised to deliver such services. So the DBSA has accepted the role of supporting COPTA with the implementation of the model in the 2 district municipalities that we're piloting, which is Waterberg and OR Tambo, as well as in eThekwini as a metro. And we made the DDM and the infrastructure fund in the bank our strategic programs. So we put them as our strategic agenda every time we discuss, whether in ExCos, whether in boards. We're really beginning to focus much more on the DDM and the infrastructure fund. And we have dedicated resources to that effect to drive these programs. But this firstly entails setting up institutional structures, that we're establishing program management capacity, setting up the district hubs, and critical is also the shared services platforms that we're really beginning to put in place to ensure that we start mitigating for the lack of capacity, especially the technical capacity and the skills that the minister has alluded to, because that is also an impediment towards us advancing to really the rollout of infrastructure in the country. Second in our support is actually around the development of a system to enable one plan and one budget outcome, as well as the monitoring of the project's interventions. Because most of the time, you'll recognize it's critical for us to know where our projects, how are they doing, so that we are able to then ensure that the interventions are really, giving us the developmental outcome that we're really looking for. Thirdly is the fact that we're looking at a system that will aim to improve the quality of the district profile. So as you know, each and every district has got its profile. It's important for us to pay attention towards ensuring that these profiles are very critically driven, because they are much more our reference point to ensure the success of the model in changing the socio-economic outlook of our communities. So that is basically knowing what we're really doing, but also monitoring what we're doing in order for us to ensure that we take stock of saying, are we really changing the lives of our community? And the fourth part that I want to intimate is that we aim as the DBSA to make available our capabilities and co-create solutions with local government to ensure bankable or ready projects for implementation, credible infrastructure master plans for critical sectors that has been spoken up in the morning, and also financing infrastructure projects, as well as infrastructure implementation and delivery. And part of what we recognize there is that we must also then assist government or the local government in terms of revenue management enhancement. And the other issue, as I explained, is the issue of the asset management. And Minister has spoken about the issue of the climate change. We also then are saying we really are more geared up to support in relation to climate mitigating solutions that we really are looking at. So significant progress has been made in this regard in terms of setting up the systems and setting up the infrastructure for the rollout of the DDM. So in my view, we are also having this session during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the pandemic is ravaging our national and local economies, and therefore that is disrupting our already ailing capacity to provide and deliver services to our community. But we say it's a good crisis presenting opportunities for new approaches, as the minister has indicated, and really DDM becomes one of the key issues in that respect, key instrument in that respect. But we call it time to reset, as the president has alluded some time. And I'm saying is a time to reset the capacity of local government and the pace of service delivery. We are saying it's the time to reset the approach to overall economy. It reset the approach to funding local government. It's also a reset of our minds towards strong sense of community and citizenship. There is an issue that people first, and I think that that basically the accountability principle becomes quite very critical in our approach. But I'm also saying that it's also, the pandemic is also saying to us is the time for us to redirect our approach. And redirecting our approach, I mean, we redirect the limited resources towards reliable and sustainable delivery of basic services such as water and sanitation, as we have seen with COVID having exposed us. And again, we're saying, let's redirect the national and provincial government and associated entities towards innovative projects, investing in local communities to locally placed projects. And the critical thing there is attracting investment in the local spheres for the needed jobs. And again, that will be waging war on poverty. It is therefore only logic. It's a logical framework for us to demonstrate. The DTM is actually giving us a clear logical framework that demonstrates the real commitment of government working together and fostering the coordination in governmental relations. I think it's also further to deepen the shared services in terms of resources and skills to implement infrastructure projects. So we should really then be in a position to say, DBS has got this particular capacity, other institutions have this capacity. Let's bring it together to tackle these challenges that we face with. But also, that is basically a framework that makes us to achieve sustainable delivery of basic services, including bringing access to ICT and connectivity to a community. And that will conclude my remarks in this respect.
Thank you very much. Group Executive of Infrastructure Delivery Division at the Development Bank of South Africa, Mr. Chwene Ramphele. Tangible results is exactly what the ordinary South African has been calling for from government for quite some time. And it's very interesting that the next submission I'm extremely interested in, because we are hearing from one who represents practical experience of the role of provinces and metros in driving what is being sought in terms of a fast-paced infrastructure development. Former eThekwini City Manager, Dr. Mike Sutcliffe, the floor is yours, and I'm interested in your particular submission because when we speak to South African citizenry most of the time, the notion really is that the seeing of development is not so watertight in that it is within our hands to tangibly see that there is work and progress currently being done.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks again for inviting me to this. I want to start, though, with something that you think has nothing to do with infrastructure, but I hope will help you it does. There are two movements that have impacted on this society probably more than anywhere in the world. And the first is racism, and the second one is sexism. And both of those are writ large in the concrete of our country. So when we talk of infrastructure, we must always say to ourselves, are we creating a place that is safer for a woman to walk at 1 o'clock in the morning by herself down the street and go? Are we creating a society in which, because you were black before and now we're dumped somewhere that is so-called uneconomic and now have to travel on taxis that might be, are we actually changing that city? So I want us to say is let's not forget that when we talk about these two very important movements, as our president was talking about the other night, that we really are thinking of infrastructure in that way, because the more we build shopping centers stuck out in the middle of green fields where cities have to spend 400 or 500 million rand to provide bulks to them, and they themselves create fewer jobs than the jobs that are created at a local level, we've got to understand that we've got to rethink the kind of infrastructure that we want in our society. When we talk about a model, and I'm certainly not going to go through the overall framework that I think our minister did, covered extremely well, I want to focus a little bit on what is my experience in a city level and working now with COGTA and MISA and DBSA and organizations like that. What I would say are the 10 principles that I think we should be thinking of. The first of those is that you should remember that all development starts with capable people working locally. Because if you don't have people who are getting their hands dirty on the ground, you don't do it. A few days ago, our minister was talking about the capability question. At the moment, we have about 50,000 out of the 280,000 employees, about 50,000 are skilled artisans or skilled technicians or skilled professionals involved in that sector. But if you come to a city like eThekwini, you have 400 engineers. You just have to go to Mkanyakuda to the north of us, and you might find 1 or 2 or 3 professional engineers there. So what is it? And this model then starts allowing, in the minister's case, to start saying, surely we need a better balance at that level. We need to make sure that we have engineers, because if you don't have engineers working for municipalities, and for government as a whole, let's not talk about municipalities, government as a whole, with developers and others, and make sure that there's a win-win situation before all that you're going to end up is golf courses and people being excluded further from that.
Oh, yeah.
So the first thing is that we've got to focus on that capability thing, and I think the minister's already covered that a few days ago, but it is a critical issue. Secondly, we've got to synchronize our development, because you can't have a situation where we build a road and then Telkom come along and dig it up, and then ICT comes along and digs it up. And we've got to make sure that all of our development is synchronized. We built something like 18 dams in our country, and we haven't provided reticulation to even communities around them. So often the dam is serving the farmers and serving the economic interests, but communities can't get access to water there. And providing that reticulation, as it's called, is often more expensive than building the dam itself. So let's make sure that everything is properly synchronized. The third principle, I would say, is we've got to replace and renew and create resilient infrastructure. We now have climate change, which is on us. It's not something new, which means all of our infrastructure must become flexible enough to deal with that. And if we're not replacing and renewing infrastructure, I was talking to some of the metros in preparing for this, and some of them are saying just to renew some of that infrastructure, because we have sanitation problems, we have energy problems, water problems, leakages, just to renew that will cost 2 to 3 times the existing annual budget to deal with. So we've got ourselves to a situation that we've built a lot, wonderful, but now we've got to start thinking of how do we renew and replace that infrastructure. The fourth principle is how do we reuse the infrastructure that we have? We have a whole lot of infrastructure that is dormant. So instead of saying, well, there's an old water plant here, let's turn it into a fish farm so local communities can in fact find a means of protein, etc. We leave it and say we'd rather go and build something else somewhere else. A friend of mine and I calculated, we were just looking at land across the country. There's about 10 million hectares of land that we could have national government expropriate and make sure that that land now is used for economic benefit, for agricultural benefit, for people's benefit. And it's something that exists. It's not something that's abstract that we could say doesn't need to deal with. The fifth principle is we've got to make sure all of our infrastructure is multi-use. One of the things we were designing when I was still city manager was how we would make sure that we have fiber cables, for example, to give access to people, but it wouldn't cost us much money to take fiber into people's houses. If you've got a toilet in your house, it means that there's water, if it's a waterborne toilet, going somewhere. Why not bring that fiber straight into houses there and begin to create a society where people, even in RDP houses, will have access to that internet? So we don't reinforce this division, means at school level, etc., that you can do. The sixth issue for us is what we would call off-balance sheet development. In the city, and I'm not taking credit for it, but it is in the city, in the south of Durban, part of the reason that we could provide water to Umlazi as a big township that didn't have water in parts of it was because we got into a contract with the private sector, places like Mondi, and we created what's called grey water. In other words, we took sewage and converted it into grey water, so it's not quite as dirty as sewage, and basically we're able to give business cheaper water while we actually made sure that we delivered clean water, potable water to people in areas like Umlazi. Now, that's off balance sheet because it's not money that government necessarily needs. It just needs how do we organize ourselves with business there. And generally, certainly when I was city manager, we had a great relationship with private sector. In the World Cup, for example, it's not known, but we negotiated with some of the leaders, your Clive Maintries and Moses, etc., who were in charge of the private sector business. And they agreed that we would surcharge all business in the city on their electricity bills. And that generated about R1.5 billion extra rand that we were able to do for tourism infrastructure, the beachfront, those kinds of things that business as a whole wanted, but no individual business is going to do. And if we do that off balance sheet, as it's called, it would make a difference. We must be opportunity oriented, not problem based. We sit often and list all of our problems, but rather say, what are the opportunities we have? I've mentioned one being the land question. There's a huge amount of land that could be provided. There are disused buildings that we could really generate. If we really had the will, we could deal with that. What COVID has taught us is that you have a lot of of people now living on the street that government is now saying we've got to take care of. So, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma said, look, bring homeless people off the street. Well, what happens 6 months' time? Let's think through that strategy now. So those homeless people, those women who need shelters, all of those, that vulnerable part of our society, we have now got plans for them because there are buildings that could be refurbished and utilized for them. We must always make sure what we're doing in the short term has got a long-term benefit for us. So any development that we're doing, we've got to think through that longer term there. And I give some examples in the notes there. I've mentioned the issue of the social needs themselves, which is point number 9. They're not in any particular order. But if we're not creating places that people feel safe to walk about, we've got to create 24/7 environments, particularly where there are villages or urban communities where people are living together. Let's make sure that things are operating, because then we stretch the use of our infrastructure over 24 hours and not have these peak periods where taxis only can make money if they're operating basically 4 hours a day, early morning and late in the evening. And lastly, we've got to sort out the leadership and management problem, because it's very difficult when national leaders are elected often from a municipal level, if you could think of it there, and then suddenly you've got some gangsters who are running a couple of the municipalities. It creates a challenge. But if all of us collectively said, let's sort this management problem out, we'll deal with it there, the leadership problem. So for me, those 10 areas, I think, are absolutely vital. And all of those impact on infrastructure. They impact on water, electricity, sanitation, sewerage, roads, stormwater, and transport there.
You are directly speaking to the core element of fostering a landscape that is actually conducive for an infrastructure build, but also is so multi-pronged in that we speak to the economy and we speak directly to participants of the economy. That's Dr. Mike Sutcliffe speaking from that practical experience as the former eThekwini city manager on the role that can be played by provinces and metros to aid infrastructure development. Of course, we can't talk about infrastructure development without involving funding institutions. And this is where I would like to bring a group treasurer at the First Rand Group, Mr. Andries du Toit, into this conversation. Mr. du Toit, definitely funding is a matter we can't ignore in this conversation. We've spoken about social elements. We've spoken about seeking workable solutions that involve economic participation from every single person in South Africa, irrespective of their social standing. Where do private funders come in?
Okay, no problem. Good afternoon, to Honourable Minister, and thanks for the opportunity, ladies and gentlemen. Just to maybe make it practical on the district development model, and if you look at the network on the infrastructure projects, being energy, water, transport, and IT, that touches all 3 spheres of government. And even in our organization, what you need to effectively those 3 spheres of government to make it happen. So right from a branch level, our town, and total. Now, the funding aspect that we in the private sector provide is from, let's call it, branch level up into the district or metros, provincial, inland or outland, and then to a national level. Now, in that aspect, we have made a couple of proposals to the various government divisions, both National Treasury as well as the Central Bank. Effectively, how do we, the concept of what we call crowding in. Now crowding in is both MDIs, multidisciplinary or multi-department institutions, DBSA, DFIs, development funding institutions, private sector. And in private sector, you probably need 2 aspects, the banking sector and the SIDSSA, long-term asset managed pension funds. And we feel as some of the proposals, the way to get scale and repeatability and a sense of governance, and then to make sure the roles and clarity and responsibility is distinguished between the 3 governments, or 3 spheres of government, is to effectively create quite a large infrastructure fund across the 4. That fund effectively will issue various instruments. Some of the colleagues have already alluded to that. And the issue is, if you think about South Africa Inc.'s total balance sheet is roughly 18 trillion, both across all the spheres of investors. So the funding availability is not a problem. The DBSA colleague also have, panelists have also alluded to that green money, in order of what's been internationally allocated, is far superior of what we can deliver. So what do investors look for? And Dr. Sutcliffe have already referenced to 10 points. So it's clear responsibilities of mandate, governance, i.e. governance straight from project management. We assess the projects and right up into implementations, performance metrics. How is the, let's call it that project being delivered and performed against certain benchmark and then contractual arrangements. And then linked to green. Now, green is much wider than just economic outlook or the economic interest. Is the development needs taken into account? Is the vision and strategy of inclusive growth, as what the government has alluded to? How do we assess? How do we accelerate some of the inequalities and inefficiencies that we have? And then do we meet the broader development needs? Now, normally that cost, in order to then reduce the funding cost, because the fiscus capacity and ability to gather more of funding is limited, just given COVID and also the economic cycle we're in. So what do you further need? You need then the private sector, or the MDIs or the DFIs to effectively come in order to build scale. Then the second one is of the 256 projects that's been ascertained, how do we then prioritize them? And I concur with the round table. You need first couple of quick wins, next 3 months, 5 or 6, and then normally one gets momentum. Further to that aspect, then the clear responsibilities. What is the responsibility of local government to deliver that aspect of a project, and the measurement of how does it get implemented? Let's call it provincial as well, and then national is the overall coordination and project, as the Honourable Minister has mentioned. I think it's quite excited. I think COVID is creating an absolute opportunity to readdress some of the projects or inequality on efficiency. But as all the other panelists have said, it's going to require coordinated effort, not just across the spheres of government, but also into the private sector, and let's call it the multinational internationals, in order to deliver that. And I do think if there's standardization on some of the projects in terms of reporting, measurement, oversight, and governance, that will create further, let's call it comfort and confidence in order to bolt on projects as they materialize. Thank you, Tuma-san.
Oops, you've muted. Have you muted?
Be having gremlins there. It must be the mute button. Welcome to social distancing and doing all things on the World Wide Web. It is a new and uncharted territory for myself, even as young as I am. But I was saying thank you so much to Mr. Andries du Toit, who's the group treasurer at the First Rand Group, talking about funding, and as we talk about infrastructure development and the infrastructure build in South Africa. There's been a major push by government, by President Cyril Ramaphosa, for further investment with regards to the infrastructure development plan in South Africa. And we will now be getting into that question and answer part of this engagement, as solutions are definitely needed. That is to ensure the delivery and effective implementation where progress is concerned, that aims to, of course, improve the South African economy, growth, job creation, and the positive outlook that is really needed when we look at the South African economy towards towards building or creating sustainable living for all of us. Let me go back to COGTA Minister, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. Minister, we've heard most of the submissions apart from what the role of SALGA is in this regard. And going back to you with regards to this particular push for the local government as well as provinces and metros, the role that they play in the accelerated infrastructure development build in South Africa. You spoke and gave an example around the RDP model. In current day South Africa, we are though seeing those inequalities, and they come and they are laid bare by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are still seeing that a trajectory that exists is that those who are disadvantaged continue to be exactly that within the context of economic participation. To what extent can we allude the infrastructure build and plans around that to tangibility of creating sustainable jobs in South Africa and communicating that message to a citizenry that may be despondent at this point when we look at the unemployment figures that came out today from Statistics South Africa? As you also indicated prior, is that Black South African women are also within the biggest group of the disadvantaged. How then do we get this role to speak to exactly that as well as advancement?
Thank you very much. I think, as the President and others have said, I think we should look at this crisis as a reset button. And tell ourselves that we're not going to do things as we have been doing them before. Whether it's the way government works, or business, or the way the financial institutions work, all of us must look at this as a reset button. And that's why, for instance, in infrastructure, as we build infrastructure and grow our economy, it must also be in the context of providing basic needs. But it must also look at how do we expand the economy, because it cannot be just the ones who are in the economy today, that it's only them who will be in the economy all the time. We must bring in new players. And the government, a developmental state, one of its responsibilities is precisely to do that, to see that there are new players, there is support to them, and that the development is guided, and also business works together to some extent with government on those areas that government has identified as going to be the drivers of the economy. And that's why also in my input, I emphasized also the skills, because we need to ensure that the skills are there to drive the economy, because you can have the brick and mortar, you can have capital, but if you don't have the skilled people, it won't happen. Whereas if you have got skilled people, they will figure out what to do with the rest. So it's very important to not forget that element. And in those skills, and those skills need to be from high-level skills, tertiary engineers, and you name them, right up to artisanry skills. And that is how you can then be able to be inclusive in the economy, because people will participate at various levels, both in terms of the ownership of the economy, but also the type of jobs that people can have, but also the type of the economy must change. We can't always be sending things that are raw. We must, even if it's agriculture or whatever, we must make sure that we participate right through the value chain, agro-processing, marketing, retail, exporting. So I think we must just look at this period as a new period that has been brought, or a silver lining, as they say, that has been brought by this crisis, to now bring in everyone and do things very differently. And I'm glad if business also, the private sector, is accepting that we can't go on as we have been doing. So between government, the private sector, and the community as a whole, I think we can at least change things.
Let me keep you a little longer on that point, Minister. You raise the issue of rethinking and reimagining how skills development is done going forward, and a new way of doing things in the so-called new normal. Is there a deliberate push to put the female agenda when we talk about the development of a skills base in South Africa within the context of the opportunities that lie in a push behind infrastructure development?
There has to be, for a variety of reasons. Women are part of this country, this continent, and they must be part of the economy. The women are the majority. Now, if you ignore the talents of the majority of your people, how do we think we can ever reach our full potential as a country? But also, women have also added advantages. I would like to think of women as people who are able to multitask. So, and at work and at home, they can do many things. If you look at the companies, if you take the world's global companies, those that have got more women in their top management, you'll find that they are more competitive than the others that don't have. So I can go on and on. There are lots of advantages in bringing in women, besides that it is their right. But there are economic advantages, there are social advantages in bringing women into the mainstream of the economy and in the skills.
The time is absolutely now, because as I alluded to, the latest quarterly labor force survey that was released by Statistics, the trajectory in South Africa is not changing when it comes to diversity. Let me move on to Dr. Sutcliffe here. We've got a question from Mohammed Baba, and he's asking, is there a possibility of making non-viable municipalities sub-councils of district municipalities? In this way, he's suggesting that there could be a balanced functionality and participatory democracy. What are your views there, Dr. Sutcliffe?
Well, I suppose it's really a question that the minister is the responsible for it, but as it's her job to look at the macro configuration of the state, I'll throw out some comments from my side. I do think that we've had 25 years or so of democracy and almost 20 years of local democracy. It is time that we rethink that, because this was a model that was really bringing together a negotiated settlement of white South Africans, or a white regime that was scared of the future, and we had to find a negotiation there. We're now beyond that. Anyone who doesn't trust, as the minister was saying now, doesn't trust where we are now, shouldn't be in this country. So we've got to build that trust now to say that actually we've got to make sure that we're giving advantage to everyone. So I do think it's time that we re-looked at the system as a whole, not to say everything changes. In a place like Northern Cape, for example, it's crazy that you have huge local government municipalities where you could simply be electing a district municipality and almost having a town board for the small village of 100 people that exist in there. So we certainly can. When we originally wrote the legislation, we didn't think of those opportunities. We were reacting because the Western Cape at that stage wanted sub-councils for Cape Town. We gave it there and we stuck it in the legislation. So I think there are things that exist in legislation. It's not like we have to go through a massive rethink, but there are other things we are going to have to deal with given the Constitutional Court's judgment last week. I do think that we want to look at those things that will make government work a bit better, But I certainly concur with the argument that the Minister was making, that there are already things happening now that we should be building on. You know, the safest part of the city I live in, of eThekwini, is actually being around the women informal traders in Warwick Junction, because they keep the place safe, they keep it clean, they make hardly any money, and yet they're the unbelievable entrepreneurs you can get. Now, what we've got to say is that that's what we've got to ramp up. They're better than any CEO of any corporate entity that I know. They understand the market better. They know where the market is, what it should be, etc. What we're not doing is finding ways that we can translate that into the reality of our economy. And the reason I raised that issue of buildings, we've got to have enough faith to start saying dilapidated buildings, why not hand them over to people like that who know how to run a project, who could transform those buildings into living parts of our city. So I think that we're in that time now where, instead of being so globally driven, where we think because something is imported, it's better, there's actually so much that can happen locally. But certainly the system as a whole, I would certainly concur. There's a lot of that tweaking we should now do to make it a system that's more participatory, more representative. There are other things we should do. The defund movement in the United States is not saying, but why is it that police are the only people you see on the streets dealing when you've got some serious issues there that require social workers and others? All defund is saying, let's put the money where it should be, creating safe places for people, thinking about who we're dealing with. That, I think, is an area of focus that we're not doing enough on. But certainly I would concur with the argument that rethink these district areas, the kind of local part of it. If I had my way, I would simply say there should be two spheres of government, national government, and then the district model, these 52 spaces. And those would be your two elected spaces. You could still have provincial, but not as an elected body. But that's a debate, I'm sure, within my own ranks of my own party.
It's a very interesting thought and element, because in South Africa we continuously debate the entire electoral system, which speaks to exactly who sits on which chessboard at what time. I must introduce SALGA Deputy President, Councillor Dion de Vos, who joins us now on this platform as a panelist. Thank you so much. And you come at an opportune time, Councillor de Vos, because the SALGA as a body serves to promote and protect the interests of local governments, a very important role as we discuss how provinces and metros can assist in this drive towards infrastructure development. Now, there's a trust deficit when we speak of local government. What then is the role of SALGA in ensuring that we eradicate that particular trust element that exists? So we know of issues around maladministration, and when we talk about an infrastructure build, we are talking about the handling of funds that may be put into those efforts. And I ask that question solely on the basis of that deficit. Councillor.
Oops.
We seem to be having a little bit of trouble there with Councillor de Vos. Let me just try that one last time. Councillor de Vos, are you with us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, so we can hear you loud and clear, and we can see you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me apologize humbly for joining late. We had some technical challenges here. On the question you're asking about the trust deficit, it is something which we are continuously discussing in SALGA, because we are serving at the coalface of communities. And if there's a trust deficit, it will be difficult for us to win the trust of communities to contribute positively to us achieving the objectives of local government. In our last NEC meeting, this was a matter we discussed, particularly in the meeting, the Auditor General was present and he made a presentation. We know that there's a lot which we need to improve on within SALGA in our assistance to our municipalities. We accept also that there's a lot of our municipalities where things are going wrong. But we must also say there's a lot of good within local government which we are doing. And I think we need all the support from national and provincial and the community to ensure that local government is overcoming this trust deficit. Sometimes we don't want to protect and defend, but sometimes there is a general negative narrative within society and publicly about local government and how it functions and handle matters. Just a simple example, there was during the week or last week, OUTA came out very strongly against municipalities, but purely in the response of the CEO of SIDSSA, Mr. George, was very clear. There's also a lack of understanding of how local government operate and how does it get funds, and it is very regulated. There's no single thing a local municipality can do without a regulation or an act prescribing for it. So we need to work on the trust deficit, but we must also address those shortages and those errors which are being condoned in municipalities. So we don't want to defend that there's some wrongdoing within some of our municipalities, but generally speaking, councillors in particular are working very hard and go beyond the call of duty in sometimes. But those elements where there's some misconduct and inappropriate actions are the narrative which is in the public domain. So I do think for any investor to invest, they will want to know what type of governance is there at that local level. So we all have a role to ensure that we deal with the governance challenges faced by municipalities, as well as that we ensure that when appointments are done, we are appointing people who are experienced, who have the necessary skills to do the work. I think the biggest challenges we face, and political parties must also take responsibility, and who we are putting into local government and the people we employ in municipalities. I think that's one I should be very clear. SIDSSA has taken it upon itself to go on an outreach to meet with all political parties to discuss the issue which affects municipalities negatively, because as you will know, SIDSSA does not have legislative powers to go into a municipality and instruct them to change behavior and so on. Or we can advocate and advise and empower and workshop and train and give skills to our councillors. But if there's outside influences which directs wrongdoing within municipalities, that is where we find a challenge from the side of SIDSSA. But we accept there is a general trust deficit, which we are working on very hardly, but we need other stakeholders to come into the party so that we ensure that we run effective, clean governance at our municipal levels. And if we can do that, that will ensure that investors will approach and come to our municipalities for investment.
Thank you so much for your honesty and transparency in answering that. Ons moet baie vinnig wees in getting towards that particular one. That's Councillor De Vos speaking as Deputy President of SALGA. And here I want to bring in back Andries du Toit to talk about really if they are impediments where private funding is concerned, especially when you look at the trust deficit that we just spoke to with Councillor De Vos with regards to the role of municipalities, provinces and metros, particularly with infrastructure development. We have had cases in South Africa where we find ourselves very embarrassed and wanting and having to answer questions that many who sit in office do not have answers to. Money has been taken out and the build itself is non-existent or not viable. To what extent does this create an impediment between the relationship between the funder and local government?
Absolutely. Yeah, so unfortunate, well, not fortunate, but banks normally lend on a couple of credit principles, and the first one is normally trust or character. And it's a long-standing principle. If it doesn't matter what stability or affordability of the borrower or the counterpart, if there's no trust or there's no trust in the character of their willingness to repay, or there's what we view this, we're not comfortable with the governance or leadership or any of the underlying structure, we don't have sight or transparency of the financial reporting, or the use of funds or the proceeds of funds, lenders, not just that, drop big time. And the availability of funding is not just price, it's just availability of funding is not there. There's no trust deficit. And it's also vice versa. Let's say from a bank perspective, there's also no trust that the local municipalities or the provincial municipalities won't then deposit funds with the bank. So that relationship, if I talk about a bank, is on both trust. It's both for the trust of doing the banking services or taking deposits from the local or any underlying projects. And if that's not there, the local municipality or provincial won't place money with the banks, and then obviously vice versa. The banks in this case, if we are very uncomfortable, not with the line of sight where proceeds or funds go to, doesn't matter what's affordability, we will also decline the loan applicant. It's absolute, that's the first sacrosanct in credit extension and borrowing, is the trust and character of the counterparty.
It's clear cut. Absolutely clear cut. And this is where I would like to invite Retro. And when we're talking about funding, I'm interested also in finding out from the side of DBSA where there may be a need to elaborate on where exactly progress can be made in terms of ensuring that there is a betterment around how the DBSA, number one, communicates, and number two, facilitates its funding for the general South African to see and translate into what it is that they can see as tangible existence of that collaborative effort between bodies that exist within government.
Thanks, Tensang. Let me indicate that we, as the DBSA, when it comes to funding, we have done obviously an extensive analysis of our current service to just check their borrowing capacities, and we realize as you look at it, there are not that capacity to borrow, or rather have the balances can carry them for them to borrow funds from the DBSA. But that did not deter us. That did not deter us. But we then put in place, especially for local government, we have got a dedicated, which basically we call the local government support unit. And that unit particularly, our intent with it is to then go back down to the ground and beginning to work with municipalities.
Pardon me, Mr. Twene. Pardon me, Mr. Twene. Sorry to interject there. I'm going to just kindly ask Councillor De Vos to mute his microphone. We are getting a bit of feedback from his microphone. Thank you so much. Much better.
Much better. No, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jimmy. I was just relating the fact that to say, the DBSA is not just only then involved in terms of just getting interested around the funding. It is also interested in building the capacity towards, ensuring that municipalities are able to then have that capacity again to borrow. So what we have done is obviously to institutionalize within our structures a local government support unit that is able to support municipalities, and that we also even begin to use our grant funding, where we really then begin to say, look, let's help you develop your revenue models and make sure that we start pushing you towards having the revenue base, and we also then ensuring that we support them in terms of knowing what exactly should the municipality do. That's why we invest much more in terms of infrastructure, master plans, so that we know that if you then have a challenge of energy or electricity, this is the kind of the universe that you need to really appreciate, so that we then can build your capacity to that effect. And on that note, we also then adopted an approach of really hand-holding the municipalities towards that level of ensuring that they're able to then realize the revenues that are required. And again, we came up with a number of instruments. I mean, one of the instruments that we're really promoting all the time is the front loading of the grants. As you know, many of the municipalities are dependent on the conditional grants, especially for infrastructure funding. So that front loading element or instrument, very critical in a sense that if a municipality is receiving funds over the next 3 years, then you are able to then say, look, let's look at what we're going to receive in terms of the next 3 years. Let's deal with that infrastructure today in order for the citizens to really, get access to the services at that particular point in time. So those kind of instruments, we realize them to say where we then can have the balance sheet cannot carry, we really have to resort to non-balance sheet or off-balance sheet kind of mechanisms or structures that we put in place. So a number of initiatives are there in the DBSA, including the Project Vumela that we really have done with regards to how we promote the issue of wastewater treatment, water reuse in terms of, and that is our effort in trying to improve, the capacity of local government to really generate revenue. As you know, that, it's important for them to be sustainable. And again, in that process, we are then instigating that there has to really be proper, job creation so that our people can then have access to jobs and they are then in turn able to then pay for the services. Because then at least we'll then be talking to you'll be creating the revenue base in that particular respect. So that is the kind of a tandem mission where we are on to make sure that much as we are really developing infrastructure, it's important to take care of the developmental aspects of them, including in terms of the job opportunities that we need to create. So, and how we communicate this, obviously, we really work on the ground. We have got a number of structures that we really interact with, and SALGA also being one of the instruments, of the institutions that we collaborate with. We are also collaborating with COCTA in terms of other structures. So those are the kind of collaborative efforts we're taking to try and get the message through to the communities in terms of what we are doing in relation to support to local government.
Thank you so much for that response, Retshwene. Minister Dlamini Zuma, do come into this one when we ask around revenue collection within provinces and metros has been a challenge over many years in South Africa. The Auditor General has highlighted. Councillor De Vos from SALGA has also alluded to that, as well as Retshwene in the latter part of his statement. How then is government intending to improve that part and that element of the local government challenges to ensure that the infrastructure build that is envisioned is going to be smooth sailing?
Thank you very much. Yes, that's one of the challenges. But let me just say there are different municipalities and different revenue collection capacities. For instance, municipalities are funded pretty much as a one-size-fits-all, which shouldn't be, because you find municipalities that actually, let's take a rural municipality, like the one I come from. There's hardly a town to speak of there. So the revenue collection is impossible because it's rural. But the rural people do expect the municipality to bring water.
Yeah.
But municipality buys that water and brings it to the rural people. It's not paid for. Rural people come and get the water from the tanker or something. And so where is the municipality going to get the revenue to pay for that water? And so that municipality hardly has any revenue base. But when they are funded as though they have a revenue base of Johannesburg or any other municipality.
I see.
So there's that set of municipalities where we've been saying if we're going to keep these municipalities as they are, then we need to look at the funding model, because we can't continue with this funding model. Then you'll find that same municipality doesn't have money to hire an engineer. So when they get money in grant to do roads, to do something else, they can't. They don't have a planner, they don't have an engineer, because they can't afford to pay for those skills. So that's one set of problems, that it doesn't matter what you do until there are huge economic activities in that municipality and it's able to then have a revenue base, it's going to be difficult. And then there are those municipalities like metros, which have a sizable revenue basis where they do collect. But also remember that in these metros, you find a lot of people that I talked about earlier who come from rural areas, coming for a better life in the city. But instead of getting a better life, they just swell the urban poor. So they go and put up shacks and everywhere. And the municipality then is obliged to provide some services to those, but there is no revenue they can collect from those people because they don't work, they are just hustling, if anything. So we must look at municipalities in an objective, and there are subjective and objective reasons why some of them can't collect. And of course, you also have historic problems where people were not paying for the electricity. And some of them are still not paying because if you look at those informal settlements, some of the electricity is provided illegally. And so the municipality is not able to collect revenue from those. But in some instances, they don't have proper systems that assist them to collect revenue properly. So there are lots of different reasons. And we, as you heard from DBSA, that we are also trying to make sure that we give that capacity. In some instances, it's unmaintained and old infrastructure where water leaks before it even sent to the people who must pay for it. So if that water has leaked, who's going to pay for it? So they lose a lot of revenue through that. So there are lots of things that we can't just say it's one reason or one problem. There are different problems that have to be resolved so that the municipalities have to be able to collect revenue. And of course, COVID has just made that situation worse because if people are not paying for their services, municipalities not then able to collect revenue. And if people don't have jobs, they won't be able to pay for what they've been paying before. So it's a vicious cycle that we have to look at, brought about by COVID as well.
Absolutely, Minister. Thank you so much for that. And at this point, I would like Andries du Toit to answer this one. Is there space for funding of an accelerated infrastructure build in South Africa during crisis time? COVID-19 has been likened across the globe as wartime, a time where priorities need to be shifted, and an infrastructure build, many have asked, is this the right time to be accelerating that?
Yes, thanks, Mr. We think so. We think COVID, or the COVID pandemic, from a financial and economic perspective, it's going to be quite a while, but there should be some recovery. Now, given the bank's capacity have already provided some relief, the government has a lot of initiatives, as announced by the president, further economic relief. And then the third one, internationally, there's quite a few relief packages. As I indicated initially, the funding is not a problem, is to identify process and governance, and then the projects. And then there's other financial techniques in order to match the cash flow. So let's assume that the first 12 months of the infrastructure build out, it's going to take time before there is either economic recovery or repayment of the cash flows. There's various instruments, what we normally call subordinated or equity or zero coupon bonds that can match that. So I think it is the right time to accelerate, given the worldwide, what we call quantitative easing. There's more than enough funding available. Is to find the right project with the right governance to match it, as I said. Yeah,
Hey,
so
Andries,
I wouldn't
you
see that
mentioned
as-
that economic term that many don't want to hear about. That QE, quantitative easy.
Yeah, sorry, not for South Africa, international.
I hear you, and it's interesting that you throw that term on the eve of the revised budget that we will be getting from Finance Minister Tito Mboweni tomorrow. I'm sure all eyes will be on the minister as we look towards the economic prospects of South Africa during crisis time. We've got a question from Dineo Chris Mutsidi. She's asking, how do we avoid weaknesses in the IDP's finding, expressing in the one plans of districts and metros, especially relating to collaboration and partnerships among crucial role players? I'll put this question to Councillor De Vos. How do you answer to this one, Councillor, as a representative of SALGA, weaknesses in the IDP's findings, expressing in one of those plans of the districts and metros related to collaboration and partnership? Councillor De Vos, are you still with us? We seem to be losing Councillor De Vos here, but hi, Councillor.
Hello.
Yes, sir. A question from Dineo Chris Mutiridi asking about the importance of collaboration between districts and metros. How important and crucial is this partnership? And earlier on, when we launched and began this discussion, COGTA Minister Dr. Dlamini Zuma spoke about an approach that is a move away from speaking in silos from the side of government.
Thank you very much. I think it's very important and it can't be overemphasized. For example, I'm from a municipality in the Sarah Baartman District Municipality. Nelson Mandela Bay is the metro, which is fully surrounded by the district municipality. Mm-hmm. And you got and the interlinkage between these districts and the metros, you can't underestimate it. Most of our communities who goes to these metros come back to the districts when they are finished with their work, and so it is indeed a good thing, and it needs to be emphasized. It's very important that there is a link and interaction between the districts and the metros, because in most of the districts the raw materials are being developed, and these materials are being processed in most of the metros, which means there's continuous interaction between the districts and the metros, and both communities are benefiting if it can be strengthened. For example, a practical example is COVID-19. Most of the people, there's the traveling in between districts and metros. So there have to be a strong working relationship, which has been proven now with COVID-19 and the jobs which has been established. For example, in the case which I'm talking about, Sarah Baartman and Nelson Mandela Bay, there's an emphasis that there must be some working relations even between these two jobs to deal with COVID-19. So I must agree. The interaction and integration or working together between districts and metros is very important, because communities are traveling in between the metros and the districts where they come from.
Oops, we can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Are you able to hear me, Dr. Sattler?
Okay, there, we can hear you now.
Thank you so much. We've got a question from Godfrey Ramadisa, and he's basically asking, or rather, making a statement that the weakest link, rather, in the engineering and public infrastructure system is the fact that unqualified and non-technical people are occupying technical positions in most infrastructure departments across all tiers of government. With your experience in local government, would you agree that there is still issue with that particular element of skills that we've been talking about?
I certainly would agree with that, because, and it's a thing that I want to take up with the Minister of Higher Education, because local government falls under a SIDSSA. So there's local government SIDSSA that every year produces skills development plan. They look at every employee in every municipality, gender, race, disability, NQF levels, etc. So you have a record of every person, and you can track every municipality, what position, what qualifications they have. You don't have that for provincial and national government. And I think that's a huge problem that we have, where our national ministers or our MECs are often depending on people who either don't have experience or don't have the kind of technical knowledge of infrastructural issues to deal with that. And that's why I was saying is that one of the advantage of a district development model is that it will then bring together people who often do have experience with that. Now, that's not to say that at a municipal level we don't have issues, but at least there's competency frameworks now. There's tough courses that you have to write from a financial point of view. There's also competency frameworks that dictate what kind of degrees you need if you're getting into the technical domain or the planning domain or whatever. So certainly on that, I do think that there's a mismatch in government, that provincial and national government certainly need to either become part properly of SIDSSA or they've got to go through their own process there. I did want to just get back to a bit of a discussion that is it Andries or Andries was saying earlier, because when I speak of trust and this issue of that relationship, you know, the history of borrowing in South Africa, if you look at the pre-1990 period, what you had was banks like Volkskas, etc., they funded local municipalities, and there was a strong relationship that existed. Then just before the transition in 1994, all of those banks, almost all of them, said, listen, we don't want to get involved in local government, so we'll create an institution called INCA to do it on our behalf. And then the DBSA has kind of got in there. Now, the point that I want to say to the banks is that building of that trust is that if I want to apply for a loan for a house in a small municipality, the bank has no problem in lending me money. But actually, the success of that house that I'm going for is dependent on whether that municipality functions. And I'm really saying it takes two to tango, that there has to be building of that local level relationship between the banking community and the management of municipalities. You know, every quarter I met with all the banks in the city here. They all came into one room with me. They could ask me any question about any investigation going on. And that for me is just normal practice. It's not something that's, you know, some grand thing. Now, when I talk to my colleagues in other municipalities, in small municipalities as well, they say, no, you know, it's still quite racially divided. So you'll have a black manager there who's now doesn't quite have that status. So I really would urge the banking fraternity in particular, and by that I mean SIDSSA as well, not just the banks. They've got to really get at that local level to build that trust relationship there, because that's the way we'll get a lot of those local level monetary kinds of things being solved a lot more easily than waiting for DBSA, waiting for all these high level things to happen there.
I would definitely like to spin that one off back to Mr. Du Toit there. But in current day South Africa, we still do have issues with the treatment and the inequality of the banking system based on who the client is. Where are we in terms of changing that particular narrative, as Dr. Sutcliffe has alluded to?
Are you asking me or Andries?
I'm asking Mr. Du Toit.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Andries?
Yeah, so on the first one is, so after the 7 C's of credit, so let's say the trust or character has been tested, then we look at, let's call it affordability. Now, there is a work stream that's been launched by BASA, our banking association, to look to what Dr. Sutcliffe have alluded to, is the municipality crisis that we have in SA. COVID has just accelerated the financial, and because of the, let's call it the contraction in economic activity. So the municipalities are really struggling because of the repayments of water, lights, rates, housing is not happening. So that creates a huge amount of pressure on all the municipalities, both small and metros. So there's a discussion that we're having on PASA, how can we assist? I think on the racial, we don't work on that basis, as there is a large perception, but it's And we disclose all that, how much do we lend to all our customers, and it's definitely not based on race. We don't lend on racial lines.
It's based on affordability.
It's the 7 C's, so it's affordability, capital structures, capacity, all that. But affordability is the most important once you pass the character test.
In an unequal society, but that's a conversation for another day. We're not having that one today. Minister
Dlamini Zuma. Policies are not on racial lines, definitely not.
Minister Dlamini Zuma, please do come into this one, because I'm interested in finding out government's engagements with lenders and lending organizations, particularly in the private sector. Are we at a footing where the client, as government, as provinces, as metros, as municipalities, are essentially truly really being seen on an affordability status? What's the situation there, and how do we better improve that relationship?
Thank you. I think that's a difficult one, because it's not just what government says and does, it's what the lenders also and the banks look at. And I think I'll throw in something that I think would be a debate for another day. Do we have enough financial institutions diverse enough to cater for the diverse needs of our people, our municipalities, our co-ops, our small business? I know it's not a debate for today, but I do think it's a debate for another day. Because my view is that we don't have a diverse enough financial institutions to cater for everyone. And we must look at that as well. And maybe one day we must also have a municipal bank, why not? But for now, I would say that I wouldn't say that everything is equal. Because even as we say, I agree, the lending may not be racial, but the affordability is.
Absolutely.
So I can go on and on, but I'll leave it at that.
It's safe for you to leave it at that. You are still in office, Minister. Let's not get headlines. And
one quick thing, though.
Yes, Dr. Sutcliffe.
In defense of municipalities, I keep challenging every banker I meet, every person I meet. Tell me one municipality that has defaulted loan. Now, municipalities have defaulted on ESCOM and water boards, and those are because of some of the other issues that go on, and I think the minister's indicated that. But generally speaking, far more people default on housing loans, etc., than on municipal, than municipalities defaulting. And that's what I'm saying, is that municipalities, in spite of their weaknesses, have generally, I don't know any that have been defaulting on loans. Many of them might defer loans and might engage in that. So I'm just saying, I think that debate that the minister says, I'd be very happy to be on her
It is a time of opportunity, Dr. Sutcliffe. Rachwen, I'm interested in your views. I'm interested in Mr. Twene's views here as a representative of the Development Bank of South Africa. The scope, and especially when we talk about opportunity that comes with COVID-19, there have been talks of a state bank too. Is there even more room? Because at times we may get to a point where the Development Bank of South Africa is simply not enough to fund government's projects. And in the context of this conversation, the infrastructure build at the scale at which we needed to expand from 2020 and beyond.
Yes, indeed. I mean, if all was equal and you start looking at the need for funding at the level of local government, you'll find that it's quite really huge. And we know that the fiscus is basically shrinking in terms of the funding, especially for local government. And I think that as the DBSA, obviously, with its current capacity, it can go a particular way. I mean, it can go a particular distance in terms of covering the funding gap that might exist out there. I think, as the minister has alluded, yes, at some point, I think it might then be useful to see, other emerging funders coming to the party. But what we also have adopted as a strategy is also, where possible, to then even crowd in some other institutions that are really interested to be funding local government. Getting with other institutions that may be having that interest. But the critical thing here might also be how our attitude is basically positioned in relation to crowding private sector in the process. It might not necessarily be that we require many funders. It might be a question of saying, how best do we then utilize private sector to come and invest in our rural and township economies and make the environment much more enabling, to an extent that basically we then start to leverage the rent which is in the hands of the private sector, and then try and bring it into the mainstream to facilitate for funding at local government. So, and I think as we do that, obviously in tandem, we have to make sure that the environment is enabling. As the minister has indicated, we must make sure that we've got the right competent people on the ground that are really taking care of this responsibility. But we also have to really ensure that the conditions are really conducive for the participation of private sector. And that, I think, should really then be in a position to be other ways of trying to bring in resources into the picture. Hence, from a DDM perspective, I think you have to create that target that we're able to then know how much money gets into that particular district and for what purpose do we then use it for. But also to say, if there is any funds that are required, how do we bring them into this particular kind of a pot to make sure that at least we then take care of the local government needs. So I think, as you rightfully say, there may be not necessarily, there may be a need, as you say, for additional players in terms of the funding. But I still think there's an opportunity also on the other side of leveraging what we have from the private sector and trying and saying, how do we bring them into the picture with a conducive environment for investment, so to then increase the kind of the rent that we really are currently stretching at this point in time.
Speaking back to the issue of collaboration, and as we go into closing remarks, I'll start with Councillor De Vos. Generally in 2020, as we look, we find ourselves in crisis time due to the global COVID-19 pandemic, Councillor De Vos, but looking into what we may be holding as a hopeful crystal ball, is the development model, the district development model, what South African provinces, metros need to go forward?
Thank you very much. I think SIDSSA has been campaigning for a long time for the model, the district development model. And now that it's here, we will take all advantage of it to ensure that the interest of local government and the communities within local government are addressed in collaboration and in cooperation with all the spheres and sectors of society. Just a simple practical example now. I keep on making an example of COVID. You've never seen departments and stakeholders working together in such a manner as now against the pandemic. And I was from a Munimec this morning, where we discussed with the MEC and in the district yesterday, where the deployment of the Deputy Minister Kapa, where we meet with her as the champion within our district. The experiences which we are picking up and happening now, I think it should not be left after COVID is past. If we can continue working on the current experiences and build on them as we fight this pandemic and deal with the other issues and challenges of our communities through the same manner and vigor as we are doing now. The district model is the best vehicle for us to achieve our objectives of creating a better life for all our communities. And the cooperation of intergovernmental relations has been strengthened now, and we must continue to do that. And if we work for the same goal in a district, all departments and sectors, I do believe and I do think that we will achieve our goals which we are setting for ourselves. So the district development model, we are fully receiving it and we are appreciating it. And we will, from SALGA side and our municipalities, we will cooperate and put all our effort in it for it to succeed, because it's something which we have been canvassing for some time.
Practically, how does SALGA do that in terms of holding those metros and provinces, municipalities within those type of districts accountable for wrongdoing?
I was saying we had an NEC meeting last week where the AG also made his presentation on audit outcomes. What we are saying to ourselves as SALGA, it will be useless for us to continue campaigning and complaining about how municipalities are not getting what they are supposed to get from the budget or from the allocations. As you will know, we are getting less than 10% of national revenue. But most of the things, and we claim that local government is the coal face of service delivery. But in terms of the allocations and the distribution of national resources, we are less than 10% of revenue. But we are saying within SALGA, it will be our campaign and our input won't carry much if we don't deal with those challenges and problems which are persistent within our municipalities. So we have taken it upon ourselves that we must deal with our municipalities and be very frank with our municipalities and the leadership in terms of wrongdoing within local government and municipalities. Because you can just imagine, we campaign for funding, but always national and province will throw it to us. But when you got the funding, the little bit you are having, you can't spend it very good. So it put even SALGA in a bad space if we continue seeing some wrongdoings within our municipalities. So our task is to continue emphasizing on good governance and stability. The main problem within our local government, where there's no administrative and political stability, and we don't appoint the right people in the right positions, and we stop outside interference, we are not going to get very far. So our emphasis in will remain on ensuring that we empower our councillors and we make sure that we comply with legislation, and that where wrongdoing is, there are code of conducts within municipalities. Empower speakers to follow the code of conducts which are there for both officials and administrators. But this is what we will emphasize internally. But what also needs to be done, we must also empower and educate society that they have responsibilities too within our communities towards local government. Where services are delivered, people must pay for it. Because you find that people are generally not paying. Sometimes you find people staying in ESCOM areas, people who are getting big salaries, but because we can't enforce our credit policies in those areas, they also just don't pay because we can't apply our credit policies. So society also has a responsibility, so that local government together we can rid it of this bad image which is there and the trust deficit which we have started with. And that is what we are committed to as SALGA, to deal with the wrongs which are continually creating, because it does empower us to fight and campaign for local government, but also to raise the challenges which are seriously faced by municipalities, as the minister has also already referred to the challenges which we are facing. We will also deploy our SALGA, NEC and PECs are also deployed to districts to ensure that the DDM is implemented, and we play our role in municipalities to bring their part to the table.
Salga Deputy President, Councillor Dion De Vos, thank you so much for that. Mr. Du Toit, as a parting shot from you, what is it that needs to be done in terms of the private lenders coming onto the table to collaborate with government, as it is the issue that Minister Dlamini Zuma started off with in saying it is the sort unity that has been already spoken about by President Cyril Ramaphosa that is much needed going forward into a different landscape on an economic basis for South Africa.
Yeah, no, thank you. I concur with all that and what Minister has said. And we as First Rand and through the Banking Association, we are very keen to really get involved to address all the problems and how we as a banking sector can accelerate. And in order to address all the inequalities and to help unemployment, to build a much more better inclusive growth and a much more inclusive society, to build a sustainable, because that's what we all interested are in. And we're very happy and we're very keen to participate in all those discussions. And we think together we can come up with very innovative solutions.
Thank you very much for that. Dr. Sutcliffe, let me bring you back into this. And in your final remarks, I'd like to pose this question to you from Ravi Pillay. Ravi is asking, should we rather be asking different questions to come up with a breakthrough of ideas to inspire trust and confidence in municipalities? It's an example that is given here. How can private sector be institutionalized as part of the governance at municipal level?
I don't think that's complicated. I mean, that should be happening at a municipal level now. I think at a DDM level, I think as the minister indicated, the conception there is not just an all of government. It's all of government to firstly make sure they come together, coordinate their plans and deal with it. But I would argue that once that is up and running and everyone knows what powers and functions each has, what their responsibilities are, getting that coordination, synchronization going. The next step then should be to bring particularly the financial sector in, bring the taxi associations in, because you'd rather have them inside working through critical things like public transport than on the outside. So bringing in stakeholders from civil society should be part of that. And I think that is the conception. The minister can clarify for me, but that is the conception of what should happen. For me, the critical thing now is let's use the fact that COVID exists, and admittedly, the COVID structures that have been established are primarily around addressing COVID, but we should quite quickly transform them. They might not have all the correct people on there. Transform them urgently to start thinking about this post-COVID reality and allow them to develop that flavor themselves. So as Councillor De Vos says, what happens in places like Garden Route and the other are going to be very different from what might happen in a Johannesburg or in And I think that we'll be able to work through those solutions, but at least it will get that going locally. So that institutionalization can happen at two levels. The one is the normal practice of government. If government leaders don't know who the key private sector actors are, then they shouldn't be in office. And I'm talking about at a local level, because the nature of your life is that you should be working with private sector. But secondly, you could institutionalize them in the model. And I think the minister would have to clarify that, but I think that my understanding of the model is it's about governance ultimately. Get government sorted out and then bring in the other social actors.
And in that governance and social element that you speak of in the letter, Dr. Sutcliffe, is the role of us as citizenry. It was raised by Councillor De Vos earlier. How huge can we emphasize on this matter?
It is. It should be transparent. So those structures, minutes of meetings, even the meetings that are held should be open, not for chaos to erupt, but so that people have confidence that government is thinking through these kinds of issues. You know, it surprised me when I look at the scale of what government actually does and how transparent we are, but sometimes we're just not making that accessible locally. You know, you can go on the web and find out all the projects of government, all the money that's being spent, etc. So we often have this view that comes out of AG's reports. We don't have the view of the reality of what government is actually delivering. This is a great opportunity to get that discussion going.
Mr. Trene, back to you. We are in current day crisis time in 2020. What then is the expectation when it comes to funding for South Africa's infrastructure build, even during these uncertain times?
Thank you, Timson. I think we recognized ourselves, obviously, the impact of COVID, and we started really looking at our funding approaches. And one of the contributions that we're making towards the economic recovery, especially for local government, is trying to see how we are able to start doing things differently with regards to putting money aside to especially support the low resourced municipalities, what you call normally the under-resourced municipalities, which has got no capacity, obviously, to borrow. And I think we are trying now to put together such kind of initiatives to ensure that ultimately we are able to support these non-resource municipalities or under-resourced municipalities. And that is also in the advent of our infrastructure fund initiative that we would have had been spoken about in the morning. So particularly some of those projects that needs to be funded has to really be projects that are emanating from that space. But I think from our side also we need to, I need to then raise an issue of saying, it's important, as you have had in the whole discussion, to say we need to really work together. And there's a saying that says working together, together we can do more. Mm-hmm. And I think it's that kind of a spirit that we really want to embrace in supporting COGTA and government in general in terms of ensuring the developmental local government. But there are a few things that I think I need to just mention here in conclusion. It's basically, as we deal with these things, because remember, local government is meant by people. And people, yes. And obviously, whatever that is happening is because of the relationship between people themselves. So as a result, we need to start even beginning to restore the Batupele principles that are spoken about. It's just understanding and respecting the communities and making sure that we ingrain them in any particular kind of things that we really do. And in particular, as you rightfully said, it's critical that we start taking along communities in terms of whatever solutions that we believe they can really be implemented on the ground. But critical is also that I think we need to put more emphasis in terms of the recruitment at that level of local government and recruit according to the competency framework. Dr. Sutcliffe has spoken about that. To say, let us not deliberately design our demise by just employing incompetent people or employing people that we know very well that their skills or their competence is irrelevant to whatever the position that we're giving. Not to say they may be competent in other areas, but realizing that you can't then give somebody else who doesn't have a particular experience in infrastructure and just then begin to give that particular portfolio to that person. So, and the other thing that I think is critical, which I think we have not spoken about, is basically giving the life to the mandate of the, in the districts you have the so-called district development agencies. I really don't know what is the significance of that structures. Rather, we need to really revive such structures to make sure that those development agencies are able to really drive development in the space. And this, I would believe, they are being funded from the district's budgets, and we need to really start to mainstream them to really be key drivers of the implementation of the district development model. And I think the other last thing that I wanted to mention is that you have got programs that are particularly existing out there, like your community works programs, expanded works program, public works program. These programs are very, very, very critical in terms of beginning to even restore the confidence of the public. And these are kind of programs that we need to structure in and begin to pull in the forefront of our development campaign. And maybe just to lastly, to mention is that one thought that one had is that we need to start adopting one district, one initiative, especially by the departments, and critically looking at prioritizing initiatives that have employment absorption capacity. If you look at DTR, if we then promote DTR to then put its industrial parks in the districts, look at the Department of Agriculture to build agri-parks and agri-hubs per district, public works to create service centers for district and support maintenance for roads and water, we can really go a long way. I think that would be my submission in terms of concluding remarks, Dumisa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As our host, Minister Dlamini Zuma, closing remarks from you. A mammoth task awaits national government within the context of the economic impact of COVID-19 on not only South Africa, but the globe. And we have this expanded push for an accelerated infrastructure build in the country. Where are we going and how do we get there if we are trying to foster this confidence and come up with solutions that are going to be workable and tangible?
Thank you very much. Let me thank the panelists. I think what has come out of here has been excellent and we can build on it. But in a district development model, as Mike Sutcliffe has said, government is just one small component. If you look at how we have been even launching the pilots, private sector has been a very critical part of that. Not only how they can support the district, but also how the district can support the private sector so that they can be able to grow the economy within that district. I'll give you an example. For instance, when we went to eThekwini, in our interaction with the district, with the private sector in that metro, one of the things they emphasized was the port and all the challenges that were being experienced in the port. And as a result, the ministers, trade and industry, public enterprises and others are supposed to be looking specifically transport at those challenges so that we can improve the workings of the port. So I'm just saying they are not only there to support the district, but also how government as a whole in that district can also unlock some of the challenges that the private sector is facing. Secondly, the third component to that are the people themselves, the different organizations, including faith-based organizations, traditional leaders, NGOs, and communities are also part of what we call the District Development Forum, where they also can carve in the role they think they can play to promote the work of the district, but also how the district can interact with them to get views, because for us, nobody has monopoly of views. Even if you're in government, you can't say you've got the monopoly of ideas. So it's important to get everybody around so that you get as many ideas as possible. So the district model is supposed to bring everyone on board. Business, very central, but also communities are very central. Of course, financial institutions are important. And I agree with Mr. Rampele that the syndication of finances in some instances may be very helpful. And I agree with many things that have been said, and I'm taking very copious notes, and we'll go back and look at what we can do building on those. But let me just say, the rural areas we need, and that's why the district model is so critical, so that the rural areas are not rural districts, are also become areas of economic activity. And I agree that each district, we must say in this district, these are the opportunities, and therefore this district would be known for 1, 2, not many things. 1, 2, others can happen, but we can concentrate on 1 or 2 areas to make sure that that district is developed. And lastly, I want to say, you know why I feel so strongly about financial institutions and I come from a very small place. You must go and Google it when you go home. The nearest town there is within, from my home, it's 12 kilometers or so. It's called Bulwer, Bulwer.
Yes.
And that town, from when I was growing up to now, doesn't have banks. It only has one bank, Itala. Yes, there's no other bank there. But there are ATMs for us either to go and put money or draw money, but there is no other bank. So that's why I feel very strongly about financial institutions being available everywhere. And you can see that place. I grew up there. I'm now an old person there. There still isn't another bank there other than Itala. Let me close it at that. So rural areas have been completely neglected.
Absolutely, Minister. And I must thank you immensely.
We could do with a co-op bank or a local bank or something in addition to the teller that is there and the ATMs that are there.
And
But
efficiency must be the order of the day.
Thank you very much.
I thank you immensely, Minister of Culture, Dr. Dlamini Zuma, for this invite, hosting us in this ministerial roundtable, which forms part of the Infrastructure Development Symposium of 2020 in South Africa, hosted by the Office of the Presidency, seeking to drive the infrastructure development build in South Africa for a better economic landscape. I thank you so much to all our viewers as well as our panelists. May the conversation continue. We are far from the land of prosperity.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Timothy.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much, and my
panelists,
apologies
and
again for joining late.
And thank you for
Councillor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Facilitating so well. Thank you, and thanks to all the panelists.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Minister.
much.
Appreciate.
And we built on it, and we'll knock at your doors as well. Thank you
so much.
Siyabonga.
Thanks.